Good evening. I'm William J. Basanko, Chief Operating Officer of the National Archives and Records Administration and the Acting Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of my colleagues at the library and the Kennedy Library Foundation, I thank you for coming this evening and acknowledge the generous underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, our lead sponsor, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and WBUR. In his first State of the Union message in January of 1961, President Kennedy called for the creation of a Housing and Urban Affairs Department. The following month, he appointed Robert C. Weaver to head the Housing and Home Finance Administration, with the intention of naming Weaver as secretary of the proposed new department, which would also make him the first African-American cabinet member. In a special message to Congress on housing and community development on March 9, 1961, President Kennedy stated, "Our communities are what we make them. We as a nation have before us the opportunity and the responsibility to remold our cities, to improve our patterns of community development, and to provide for the housing needs of all segments of our population. Meeting these goals will contribute to the nation's economic recovery and its long-term economic growth." In April 1961, President Kennedy submitted draft legislation for the new department. The legislation met with considerable opposition in both the House and the Senate and was ultimately defeated. Anticipating a second term, JFK planned to introduce a new initiative for an urban department in 1964, but it would be left to President Johnson to secure and sign the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1965, thus finally establishing HUD as a cabinet department. Robert Weaver became the first secretary of HUD in 1966. I am pleased this evening to welcome you to our forum, a discussion with the current Secretary of HUD, the Honorable Julián Castro, moderated by Renée Loth. Secretary Castro was sworn in as the 16th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development on July 28, 2014. After his confirmation, President Barack Obama said, "Julián is a proven leader, a champion for safe, affordable housing and strong, sustainable neighborhoods." Under his leadership, the Federal Housing Administration lowered mortgage insurance premiums to make homeownership more affordable for responsible families, and HUD released its new affirmatively furthering fair housing rule to fulfill the full promise of the Fair Housing Act. In July of last year, President Obama helped launch one of Secretary Castro's signature projects, Connect Home, accelerating internet adoption in communities and providing broadband and electronic devices to children living in public and assisted housing. Prior to his work at HUD, Julián served as the mayor of San Antonio, where he became known as a national leader in urban development. He's been named to the World Economic Forum's list of young global leaders, and Time magazine placed him on its 40 under 40 list of rising stars in American politics. I am also very pleased to welcome back Renée Loth as a moderator this evening. Renée is the editor of ArchitectureBoston magazine. She's also a regular columnist for the Boston Globe. In a distinguished journalism career, Ms. Loth has held several high-profile posts at the Globe, including presidential campaign reporter, political editor, and editor of the editorial page. She was twice a judge for the Pulitzer Prizes in journalism and is a frequent guest on local news and opinion shows and panels. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Castro and Renée Loth.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, the Secretary and I are going to have a conversation here for about 40 minutes this evening, and then there should be time for questions from the audience, which I will facilitate from up here. So, greetings, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you for having me.
Nice to be here. I am interested, as I know you are, in issues of urban equity, especially as our cities, many of them are becoming more popular and wealthier, and in some cases more unequal. I think Boston, is second maybe only to San Francisco in having this problem. I mean, it's a nice problem to have in some ways, but it also threatens the kind of city that we want to be, which is a city that's open to everyone of all incomes. So I'm interested in what the federal government's role is in addressing this problem. HUD has been a sometimes on-again, off-again partner with cities in trying to facilitate affordable housing. I know that you once described HUD as the Department of Opportunity. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and how you see the federal role in trying to address these issues of fairness and equality in our cities?
And thank you very much, Renee, for the question. And I want to thank Jay and the wonderful staff here at the Kennedy Library. It's wonderful to be back. My brother Joaquin and I went to law school here in Boston, and so the last time I was here was about 18 or 19 years ago, and the place looks better than ever.
Different place, yes, it's a different
That's
city.
right. And I have a little bit more gray hair now, but only a little bit.
Yeah.
It's a great question. So, as Jay alluded to, we're about 50 years old at HUD, and it's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. So HUD is a strong partner for cities and smaller communities, including tribal communities, to try and achieve opportunity and equity. And the main ways that we've done that traditionally have been through investments in affordable housing, housing choice vouchers, public housing, of course, and then also revitalization funding like community development block grants, which came along in 1974, we just celebrated 40 years of that, home funding, and more recently in the Obama administration through more intensive place-based work, specifically things like choice neighborhoods, which seek to revamp and revitalize public housing communities, and promise zones. The idea behind those being that you have to break through the silos that often exist. In other words, it's not enough to just look at housing. You have to try and lift up educational achievement in the neighborhood and economic development in the neighborhood, access to transit, access to healthy food, the environment that folks live in. So I think that HUD has been a strong partner to communities. The headwinds that we have run into over the years have mostly been one of funding. The congressional appropriation to HUD has not kept up with the demand for affordable housing that we see out there. In fact, we have right now in the United States a rental affordability crisis. It used to be that it was these usual suspect cities like Boston and San Francisco, New York City, of course, but now the rent is going through the roof, so to speak, skyrocketing for folks, even in mid-sized and smaller cities. And what we see is that more and more families are having to pay more than a third and sometimes more than half of their income for rent. At the same time, funding has not kept up with trying to meet that need. This year, for fiscal year 2017, coming up next year, the president has done something unprecedented, which is to propose on the mandatory side of the budget, in other words, on the side of the budget that Social Security and Medicare are on, that we would fund $11 billion, so it's $11 billion over 10 years for 550,000 families to benefit from housing choice vouchers and rapid rehousing dollars so that we could functionally end family homelessness by 2020.
But this is a request in his budget. This is
it's
not
a request,
appropriated.
yeah.
Yes.
But it's a bold statement.
Yes.
This is the last budget that the Obama administration will likely put forward. It is a bold statement. Now, honestly, do I believe that Congress is going to turn around and say, here's your $11 billion for this plan? I don't believe that. But I do believe that it's a strong statement and that it helps pull the agenda in the direction of investing more and calls real attention to the need out there. Just briefly, the other way that we've tried to ensure greater equity and opportunity is through our fair housing work. We have a robust fair housing office that sends dollars out into communities so that people can do fair housing testing to ensure that we have a level playing field out there when people go into the private market to rent a place or to buy a home. Just a week or so ago, we announced new guidance under the Fair Housing Act that says landlords in the public sector and private sector should not summarily refuse to consider a rental application just because somebody has been arrested or convicted, because under the disparate impact standard of the Fair Housing Act, we understand that that minorities are arrested at higher rates, oftentimes for unwarranted reasons, than the mainstream community. And so having this summary rejection of folks just because they've been arrested, we believe does not comport with the requirements of the Fair Housing Act. Mind you, that doesn't mean that somebody can't consider the fact that somebody's been arrested or convicted. It just means that they can't have this summary rejection of folks for that reason. There has to be more case-by-case nuanced policy in place.
Well, you've anticipated my question, because I did have that question on my list here. It's very interesting guidance for the private rental market that you've issued here. It made me think about, there's probably many in the audience who are aware of this wonderful new, very profound new book by Matthew Desmond called Evicted, which is really chronicles this epidemic of displacement that's going on in many of our poor communities where people are paying rents of, sometimes 70% of their income, not able to keep up, getting evicted at huge numbers. Not here in Boston, we have a somewhat different issue having to do with rapidly gentrifying communities, but in these poorer communities, disproportionately African-American women are the victims of these evictions. And I'm wondering if you think that the same kind of parallel logic could be applied to their situation, and that perhaps the fair housing guidance could be expanded or extended to making it illegal under fair housing to automatically reject an applicant for a rental if they have an eviction on their record. Not a conviction, but an eviction, because apparently that's one of the problems. The cycle gets hard to break because a woman or, a poor woman and her family is evicted, and then landlords won't rent to them because they're a bad risk because they have an eviction in their past. What about that?
You're giving me ideas tonight. No, I've told my folks there at HUD that obviously within the confines of the law and under reasonable interpretation, that we want to utilize that disparate impact standard as much as we can. And so, I don't believe that we've looked at that. But I do think in these different instances where folks, because of their racial or ethnic background or other reasons that are protected under the Fair Housing Act, whether it's disability or other things, then we're going to be aggressive about enforcing that. Enforcing it in a reasonable way, but enforcing it.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be creative with the tools, that the federal government does have, and just try to think of imaginative new ways of applying those tools. I have a ton of policy. Excuse me? Okay, there's going to be a question period later where you can ask that.
20 minutes isn't enough. We have a big problem. Can't hear you. HUD is causing foreclosures and evictions
Okay.
right now. Julián Castro, please help my family to stop HUD for evictions.
Okay. All right. We will
Thank you
have,
very much for
formal
the
questions
perspective.
later.
I
Go ahead.
appreciate it, sincerely.
Okay, thank you. I was going to say I have many policy questions to ask you, but I wanted to just take a minute to talk to you about some of your influences. You have spoken a lot in your public speeches about your grandmother who came to this country from Mexico as a young girl, lived with relatives here. But I think some in the audience will be surprised to know that your mother, Rosie Castro, was an early activist herself and kind of in this very well-known community organizing project called the Communities Organized for Public Service. It's one of the, sort of premier organizations from the 70s, which I'm old enough to remember. You said that she took you to rallies and things when you were a young boy. I'm just wondering how that affected your thinking about politics and your approach to public service.
My mother was involved in the old Chicano movement of the late 1960s and early 70s, basically the Mexican-American version of the civil rights movement, the Mexican-American population being concentrated at that time in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, California. And so that was a third party that basically said at that time, the Raza Unida party was a party that said neither the Republican Party nor the Democratic Party at this time is really ensuring that folks have a fair shot at opportunity. And so she was involved in the Young Democrats as a college student, and then eventually got involved in the Raza Unida party. They ran slates of candidates in different states, including in Texas. And my mother ran for city council when she was 23 years old in San Antonio. At that time, there were no such thing as single-member districts there. So very few women and very few Hispanics won any of the races because you had to run citywide. I'm sure y'all went through this in Boston and just about every big American city. She interacted a little bit with cops, which is what you mentioned, which was an Alinsky group, but she wasn't that involved in that. She was more politically active. My brother and I were born in 1974. And so by the time we were born, she was starting to taper off on her direct political involvement, but she still stayed involved in different issues for women and for Hispanics. So my experience was that I grew up in a household that was very active. I joke that when I went away to college, I didn't like politics because we had been dragged to rallies and speeches, and I remember sitting in the public library for 3 or 4 hours while the adults all talked about boring stuff. But what I got out of that, the positive of that, was that I grew up with a mother that really valued democratic participation, that believed that you could make a difference through the democratic process, which was just fundamentally the nature of what they were trying to do. And even though in the beginning my brother and I sort of pushed that aside, when I went away to college, I saw the community that I had come from with this sort of fresh set of eyes, and I saw the tremendous need there. And I felt very blessed with opportunity to be able to go to college and then go to law school. And part of what I wanted to do was to come back home and ensure that other folks could have the same kind of opportunity. But it was growing up in that household with my mother that sort of provided the foundation for believing that it's worth participating in this democratic process.
Yeah, and indeed, 30 years after your mother ran for city council in San Antonio, you ran for the same office and was elected.
Yeah.
So it's worth waiting for, I guess. I'm sure she was very happy. Speaking about your family makes me think of your brother, your twin brother, Joaquin, who's a congressman in Texas, who just yesterday was at the Supreme Court in Washington speaking to a group of immigrant rights activists who were there to hear President Obama's executive order creating a pathway for citizenship to undocumented immigrants is being heard before the Supreme Court. It was a very moving kind of scene. But I'm wondering, President Obama, of course, has also deported more undocumented immigrants than other presidents in his attempt to try to cobble together a support for his other reforms. I'm wondering what you think his legacy will be toward this issue of immigration reform.
I believe that it's going to be a legacy of a president who has gone further than any other president now with DACA and DAPA to try and keep families together and to use his discretion, the discretion of this administration on enforcement, to try and keep families together. Obviously, whatever the Supreme Court decides is going to have a big impact on whether that's able to go forward or not.
Right.
But I've had the chance to interact, of course, with the president, and even when I was mayor on this issue. And I understand that both in his mind and his heart, that he wants to find a way to keep families together. And so I think that the most noteworthy thing that he's done has been DACA and DAPA, and my hope is that the Supreme Court will find, as I believe that it should, that executive action was consistent with what other presidents, Republican and Democrat, have done
Exactly.
to exercise prosecutorial discretion.
Right. Let me ask you about the mood in Washington, because you have known as somebody who works to develop relationships across the aisle. You have a focus on that. You think it's important. And yet, we've seen how that's worked out for President Obama, who has, talk about headwinds, has run into opposition from a rather truculent Republican leadership in Congress there. What's your formula then? What do you know that he doesn't know that would help you succeed where he has not?
Well, I don't even know. I don't believe that it's certainly not knowledge versus somebody else's knowledge. It's that you go through cycles of this. And I know, because I've seen it firsthand, that the president has spent a lot of time and often doesn't get the credit for how much he's tried to reach across the aisle. The fact is that there have been a decent number of folks on the other side of the aisle who have not sort of accepted that hand of trying to work with them. And my hope is that going forward, the mood is just going to change. And so there's going to be more of an opportunity for bipartisan work in Congress with the administration. I don't believe that things are going to stay this polarized.
What's going to
so
force that
fiercely
change,
polarized.
though? We keep thinking that we've reached a point of no return, right? And then, we look at Washington, jaws agape up here, and
if we put the last few years in the context of our history as a nation, we've come out of one of the worst economic periods of most painful economic periods in our country's history. The mechanisms of how Congress work have changed to some extent. Number one, because of rabid redistricting that encourages folks to just cater to their base, whether they're catering to a Tea Party conservative base or, like my brother's district is fairly liberal, very safe Democratic seat. Secondly, you did away with earmarks. And I wasn't a fan of earmarks, like a lot of other folks weren't, but when there were earmarks there, I think there's an argument to be made that probably that helped get the support of folks on some pieces of legislation. And so you've had these mechanical changes. There are structural issues around the way that people are elected that I think need to change. I'm looking forward to seeing the evidence in a few years of how California's system has worked, which I think tends to reward folks who are willing to work with people on the other side of the aisle. But it's fairly new, so we don't know how that open primary system is going to work. And then so you have the economic crisis that we went through. If we can make some of these mechanical changes, I do think that you can come into a time where people are more willing to work again. The last thing I'll say about that is that we do have a media environment that is not like it used to be. And that's not breaking new ground. Many people have said that, but it seems like everything is blown out of proportion when you turn on cable news or you flick on the internet. We were all going to die from Ebola, and then all of those kids on the border in 2014 were going to overrun the country, and then Russia was going to shoot down every plane. The sensationalization of things has reached a fever pitch. And I was mentioning to folks earlier that when I went to college, I thought that I was going to go into journalism.
Wise man.
ended up obviously going into law and going into politics.
Right.
But I,
The second most
I know.
unpopular
Well,
profession.
I tell folks, like, I became a lawyer and a politician. Like, that sounds like more of a nightmare to people than a
Journalists would
dream.
make it a hat trick.
Yeah. So I have an immense respect for journalism, and I still kind of follow the media business. I like reading about it and, reading about journalism. But I think that in some ways, journalism as a business and a practice is one of the least accountable businesses out there. And I'll give you an example. If you call a journalist up who wrote a story at a newspaper and you say, hey, the headline didn't match the story. This happens all the time. Well, we don't write the headlines.
Correct.
Right? Or the intensity that something is played with, on TV impacts the impression that viewers get. And so I think at every level of the media, of government, certainly of business, that if we want to get to a point where there's going to be more collaboration and compromise, that folks need to take a gut check and look at how mechanically they can improve certain practices or rules to make it better. Right. And all of us have an interest in doing that.
Yeah, I actually would agree with you that I think the media bears a responsibility for the atmosphere of vitriol that we've seen in this presidential campaign. Not just as a sort of accelerator of it or an amplifier of it, but because traditional mainstream newspapers are not as robust as they once were, and so there are fewer, responsible outlets out there, and so people turn to social media or, there's a lot of competition for that kind of clicks and eyeballs, and I don't know what the solution is in the media, and that's my area of expertise. So I can't imagine, what it might be, some sort of nonprofit model maybe to try to bring back some responsibility to that business model. You mentioned redistricting as one way in which our politics are being polarized and distorted. It makes me think about my other concern I have about voting in the 2016 election for those who, demographically may be, you don't even have to put a partisan bent on it necessarily, but you look at Latino voters, for example, who are such an important part of the growth of our country and the democratic process, and yet I wonder if you worry about laws that are being passed in certain key states, particularly states, I think it's something like 8 of the 12 states with the fastest growing Latino populations have passed laws restricting access to the polls, either identification rules or other kinds of restrictive access. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that can be done to assure fair access to to the polls in time for the 2016 election? What do you think?
Well, I mean, there is a Supreme Court case out of Texas, of course, looking at the voter ID over there. I'm not sure, I don't recall when that's going to be resolved, but my hope is that it'll be resolved favorably. Count me in the camp of folks who are very, very cynical about these voter ID laws. And even if you think, well, I've heard folks make a practical argument like, hey, you need ID for all sorts of stuff. If you go in, you buy beer or any number of other things, you need to show your ID. So why don't you just show your ID for voting? But the idea behind it is that folks, these legislators know that that's going to have the impact of cutting out, for whatever reason, however it falls out, you're going to cut out, basically, a couple percentage points of people. And that those people generally tend to be more favorable to one party than the other. And so the intention behind it is not really to eliminate voter fraud, not least of which because what you're trying to do, we can't really find much fraud there. If you wanted to take care of fraud, you would actually look at mail-in ballots and absentee balloting and not in-person voting, but that's not what voter ID is aimed at. But then you also look at the combination of that with things like shutting off the availability of Sunday early voting that has happened in some states, allowing certain types of ID to be used, a military ID but not an official college ID, for instance, for young folks. These issues that we saw in Arizona the other day. I mean, why in the world anymore are people having to wait 4 hours at a polling place when you know that you're going to get a lot of folks who need to vote? But that happens regularly. That's like a story that can happen in any community that you go into all the time. It is amazing to me that for something that is so fundamental to the functioning of our country, that we have not invested more in making it easier and not harder for people to vote, particularly in light of the fact that any analysis, reasonable analysis, unbiased analysis that's been done that has tried to seek out voter fraud has found such a small percentage of that happening in the United States.
Hear, hear. I saw recently an illustration, sort of a graphic that went with an editorial about this topic, that, you know, those little tags that they give you when you vote that say, I voted. It was one that said, I voted, and the other said, I didn't, and the other one said, I tried, and the other one said, I waited. And, you know, it's just, I mean, it's a sad commentary, really, you know, but pointed. I thought, you know, that those little labels. You know, are you surprised by the level of political discourse in the country this year? I'll just let you decide what I mean by that.
Well, I mean, I think my sense is that folks would say, most folks have been surprised at the level that it reached, right? At the crassness and the fact that sometimes it seemed like folks are running for junior high president instead of the president of the most respected, most powerful nation in the world. That's a decent amount of it has surprised me. I didn't know how low it would go. Now, historians will tell us, right, that, well, if you actually compare it to some of the language and the things that were done many, many years ago, you know, you pick up a newspaper from 1885 or even the early 1900s, that it makes what people are saying today look tame, or if every now and then we watch those videos on cable or on YouTube of folks in other parliaments that actually get into fistfights, that compared to that, this is nothing. And, you know, it's a point well taken. But I do think that what happens out there in the campaign trail, in the public space, that enters into the voters' assessment of the candidates, that ultimately that will impact the prestige and the assessment of the American president, the presidency itself. How long can you go in this kind of environment before the office itself is lowered? Part of that has to do with who's in that office, but I think it also has to do with how this whole thing, you know, including the campaign, ushers that person in. And I also believe that people are gaining a lot more appreciation for Barack Obama. Watching what's happening out there, I noticed that his approval rating is starting to tick upward.
Yeah, I know. Imagine a president who can put words in a sentence together and make a complete sentence. It's kind of a low bar, but
I mean,
maybe that's...
the way that he's comported himself also,
Yes.
I don't know, the folks, you know, there was this just fantastic article by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, The Obama Doctrine, about his foreign policy approach. And for the folks who haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. You know, not everybody's going to agree with his approach, but I think what you see there is someone who is very comfortable in his own skin and is thoughtful about issues, even especially issues about our national security and our national interest. And it's such a different approach and pace from what we see, the craziness of in my opinion, especially one part of the campaign trail. And I say that stepping outside of my role as HUD secretary. The lawyers would probably want me to say that, so to make a commentary about the politics of it.
Yeah. We've drifted so far from all these policy questions I had for you, so I'm going to reel us back and try to talk a little bit more about housing. You announced just recently, let's see if I can find this, announced just recently I think it's $174 million, I have the figure down here somewhere, $174 million for the National Housing Trust Fund. This is a new federal housing program to serve the very poor, some of the poorest, lowest income families. And it's the first time there's been anything like this from the federal government in something like 40 years. So, maybe almost before you were born. And so this is great, but again, it should be noted that President Obama had asked for $1 billion in his 2015, I think it was, budget for this same housing trust fund. I also think I read that HUD is facing its own huge deficit just in the billions just to, get its own housing properties back up to code. I guess this is a little bit of a version of the first question I asked, which is, why is it so difficult to get the federal government back into the housing business, and what can we expect can be done to change that?
I mean, part of the reason it's so difficult is that you have a disconnect between many folks in Congress and the districts they represent. Also, I mean, let's face it, that the folks that we serve, who are from different backgrounds, but generally they're low income when we're talking about public housing and vouchers, these are not folks that the normal elected official thinks about in terms of getting votes from. Right? Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of folks in Congress who do think about folks who are low income and are in vulnerable communities and are serving them well and want to serve their needs. But you also have, I think, folks who represent districts where, because of the gerrymandering, there's not a lot of that, or that group of folks is invisible. And so at the end of the day, there's been a big disconnect. That's why when people often, will say, hey, why aren't you doing more about this? And I have to stop and say, but I don't appropriate the money to myself. We're trying to, we have requested a lot more funds to be invested in affordable housing, but it has not kept up with the need. At HUD, the day that Reagan walked into the Oval Office in 1981, we had over 16,000 employees. And today we have about 8,000 employees. Now, some of the employees have gone, some of the functions to like FHFA, and there's been some adjustment, so I'll give you that. But still, there's a pretty strong trajectory of downward in terms of the number of employees that are dedicated to these housing issues and urban redevelopment issues. So number one, we need to find ways where that connection is stronger. And one of the things that I think may cause there to be a stronger connection is that the fact is that the middle class is feeling more squeezed these days. So people that never thought that they would be so impacted by the rent going up at a time when our home ownership rate is at one of the lowest levels in 40 years, more and more people are paying the rent, they are feeling it. So more of the constituents of these folks who haven't had to concern themselves as much with the creation of affordable housing, I think are having to deal with that. So there's hope in that. But ultimately, our ability to address this runs right into the willingness of Congress to address it with funds. Yeah. You asked about the Housing Trust Fund.
Yeah.
The reason this is a modest amount of money, it's about $174 million. It basically comes off of a fee of transactions at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It was part of 2008 legislation, HURA. The reason that it's significant, though, is because this is a unique fund that is aimed at extremely low-income individuals. Basically, those are folks that make 30% or less of the area median income. So analysis after analysis has shown that that's where the greatest gap is. I mean, that makes sense, right? The lowest of the low in terms of people and how much money they have or they make. We have the biggest gap there in terms of affordability. And this money is going to go to the states that will then be able to distribute that to their communities aimed at creating more affordable housing for extremely low-income individuals.
Yeah, I think if you ask the average American, they would say, oh, if you're just low income, you get support from the federal government, you're in public housing, or, you've got a Section 8 certificate or something like that. And I think people don't recognize or appreciate how few of those who are eligible for this kind of support actually get it from the government.
It's 1 in 4 people.
Yeah.
1 in 4 people that are eligible actually are able to avail themselves of public housing, housing choice vouchers, and so forth. So there are a whole bunch of families out there, as I'm sure folks have seen, that know some probably, that are on waiting lists for vouchers, waiting lists for public housing, for other services. Not only that, I have to remind folks sometimes that a decent number of these families are working families. People created this boogeyman of folks that were lazy and the people in public housing or on vouchers, especially because as part of the voucher you're paying a certain percentage of the rent. But this idea that they're just not working, and that is not true. That's not a good characterization of many of the families. And a lot of the ones that are not working are senior citizens, or folks who are disabled, or folks who otherwise have a challenge in their lives. And of course, you do have examples of people that could be working that are not. But I think that you have a greater example of a case of people who want to go out there and work, who are looking for work in many cases, or who are actually working or trying to get an education. And so we have to end this mischaracterization and this stigma that everybody is just on the take, and that when you invest in public housing or in vouchers, that it's just welfare that gets thrown away. That's not true. It's not accurate.
When you talk about vouchers, just to really get into the weeds, some have recommended that a universal housing voucher that is pegged to 30% of one's income would be a solution here. I was talking to my father-in-law about this, and he's a good liberal, and he said something like, well, but the problem with that solution is that landlords are just going to raise the rent to, make up the difference. It's sort of like, the scholarships to college. It just becomes an inflationary thing on the cost of the university tuition, or in this case, on the cost of the rent. Is there anything there? I didn't know what to say.
Well, I mean, I would say that we do have to be sensitive about the market impact that how much we fund vouchers at in a local community, the impact that has. And I'll give you an example of our thinking on that. When we set what are called fair market rents, generally I'm sure in places like Boston, in metro areas that have had higher rents traditionally, we have allowed them to go to basically to increase the amount of a voucher. One of the things we're doing now is going through a process called small area fair market rents that allows us to look at it by zip code and set it at a more nuanced level by zip code, because when you just do it across a city or metro area, in some of the lower income areas, first of all, we're seeing in many cities that there's still an aggregation of people in the lower income areas. But then secondly, in those lower rent, lower income areas, it has this effect of actually bumping up how much they charge for rent. Yeah, so the answer to your question is that in certain places, under certain circumstances, that's a correct assessment. That concern is not a completely unfounded concern. And the good news is that we've thought about that and we're acting on that to make these things more sensitive to the actual cost of housing, and trying to incentivize folks to get into higher opportunity areas, higher opportunity neighborhoods, and not in these areas that are more distressed, not artificially bump up the rent in some places.
Thank you. He'll be happy to hear that. And so am I. I think we're going to be going to questions from the audience very soon, but I just can't let the opportunity pass by to ask you about your political future. I think you have some fans here. And and ask you if, sort of Clinton Castro, doesn't that have a nice ring?
Well, Joaquin is available.
Oh,
Joaquin is
and you're
available.
twins, so who would know?
Yeah, a lot of folks have asked about that.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Number one, I've said a lot that I don't believe that that's going to happen. And my plan, and my family and I live in D.C., so our plan is to get back to Texas next year. But I'm happy to support Secretary Clinton, have been out there campaigning, and I know everybody's going to rush back and see the New York primary results tonight.
Yeah.
We have two good candidates on the Democratic side, but I'm supporting her, and I believe that she would make the best president.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we are recording this, and I think it's also being filmed, so we only have a few minutes for this, but if you want to go. Thank you. So if you want to ask this question, please get in line behind the other people so that we can all have a chance to ask the question. I'm sorry. There are other people waiting in line in front of you, and it's really, you need to have some respect for everybody who's going to ask questions here. Right? Thank you. Just, you'll be third if you get in line now. Don't wait. Okay, I'm going to start over here.
Hi. So as an Austinite, I would like to ask when you think Texas will go blue. And on a completely unrelated note, I hope that you're also considering a run for governor.
Yeah, no, thank you for just a general statement. These events are sometimes tricky, that I have to be careful when I'm answering the HUD questions and policy, that it says HUD secretary, and then stepping outside of that role on the political stuff and answering it just for myself, not speaking on behalf of the administration. So I read this survey in 2012 in the middle of the election cycle that was a survey by Public Policy Polling on Virginia. And it was interesting because in the crosstabs of that survey, it had a crosstab that I don't usually see. I don't read a lot of polls, but the crosstab was support of Romney or Obama by how many years they had lived in the state. The respondent had lived in the state. And overall, the president was beating Romney 50 to 45, with residents that had been there 20 years or more. Romney was winning 51 to 45. And with residents who had been there 8 years or less, the president was winning 67 to 29. So what you've seen in places like Northern Virginia, the suburbs of Denver, certain parts of North Carolina, which is interesting this cycle, is that the infusion of younger and more diverse communities have taken these states from red to at least purple and competitive. The same thing is happening in the suburbs of Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio, El Paso, but Texas is such a big state, and the infrastructure for moving that state to the blue column is weaker because it hasn't been a swing state since 1976. The modern practices of mobilizing folks, registering folks, it's a right to work state, fairly anti-union. So traditionally, what you might find in California or other places of strength of labor to organize people hasn't been there in the same way. It has headwinds to get there, but the people that are moving into Texas are more moderate. And of course, this younger generation, I think, is moving it to the left. Also, the politicians down there in Texas are not helping themselves because ever since Richards lost to Bush in '94, basically, maybe the next cycle in '98, the Republican Party has won every single statewide race. And after a while, what happens, it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, is when you have that kind of dominance, there's a certain hubris that develops. So right now, the Attorney General has been indicted for certain securities-related fraud. Just today, I saw an article down there about Chevron getting $12 million to build a building that they never built. The other elected officials have run into their own problems. There's a problem of potential corruption and waste of money. So all of that is adding up, I think, to the opportunity to move that state in that direction, but it's going to take more organizing, and it's going to take good candidates too to excite folks. And the moment hasn't hit yet, but I do think that that's down the road.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to the other side.
Okay, my question is a very short question that requires a very short answer. All right, and I want to welcome you here and thank you for coming and taking questions. Okay, I've already asked this question to my political officials and the management company of a senior complex that I'm very grateful to live in, HUD-sponsored. And they can't give me the answer, so I'm going straight to the top. Okay, my question is, can you tell me what the retirement age is for a maintenance worker who is 75 years old for a 60-unit HUD senior apartment building?
You said the question is, what is the retirement age for a maintenance worker?
Yes, that's working at a 60, the one and only maintenance worker for a 60-unit building.
That's a good question. No, I don't want to be inaccurate, so I won't venture a guess. But I'd be happy to get your information and get back to you on it.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Oh, we have a couple of my staff members here that can make
Yeah.
sure that we connect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yep.
Secretary Castro, are you aware of the HUD occupied conveyance rule? You're aware of what it does? Do you know that it requires that HUD requires banks to evict families after foreclosure? Are you aware of this rule?
Yeah, of course. I'm aware that there are foreclosures that happen, sure.
And you're aware that HUD requires that the families be evicted after foreclosure?
There are families that are, sure, there are families that are foreclosed upon, and, you know, through FHA, we try and do everything that we can through loss mitigation to ensure that folks are able to stay in their homes as long as possible. In fact, through a couple of our programs, folks are able to stay 2.5 years, 3.5 years longer than they normally would have been able to stay, because the goal that we have is for folks to be able to get back up on their feet and stay in their home. The last thing that we want to see is for folks to end up losing their home. And so
It's interesting because I'm an attorney at your alma mater, and I've been representing families for years. And HUD continues, for example, one family that's over here has been evicted. I fought you three separate evictions. HUD continues to evict families post-foreclosure when they could stay in their homes, and HUD refuses over and over to sell those homes back to those families. So I really hope that you look deeply into the policy and change it.
Well, and let me address that. Well, and this also, I do think that we should address the issue that the folks who are here have addressed, because you need to be straightforward with issues. Folks have a perspective on this. Folks have raised a question about this distressed asset stabilization program that we have through FHA. And they've said, like, okay, well, why are you guys selling these notes to Wall Street? Now, number one, there are direct sales that are available to local governments that we actually would love to be able to do more of. When I got in office as HUD Secretary, one of the first things I did was I challenged the team to come up with a way that we could get more of these note sales into the hands of nonprofits. Because the concern that I heard was, hey, why not sell these things to nonprofits that can actually have better outcomes for the neighborhoods? So what we did was that we created a whole separate pool where only nonprofits can compete for those loans. I will say that for those nonprofits, it's actually been tougher than it is for the private market folks who are competing or bidding for these notes. Oftentimes it's an issue of resources. They're just not able to service these notes in the same way. So I challenged my team again. I said, look, What can we do, first of all, to go find more of these nonprofits that perhaps have more experience in servicing? How can we come up with ways to be even more creative? And we've been working on this now for a couple of months. I'm very happy to answer the questions of folks. But let me also just kind of reflect on the way that it's been approached. I think that we can agree that the number one thing that we want is for more people to be able to stay in their home. In other words, we want a stable outcome for families, right? I don't know that sloganeering about don't sell to Wall Street is the best way to achieve that outcome. I want there to be, I want there to be more sales to nonprofits, direct sales to local governments. But on this side of the aisle, we can never reach the point that we've seen on the other side of the aisle where we just use slogans and trying to scare people into thinking one absolute rigid way. We have to find practical policy solutions that can't be captured in a slogan. And if we ever go the way of just saying one word and that making people's heads turn this way and only think this way, then we've lost. We've become the worst part of what we're seeing on the other side of the aisle, and that if somebody like that ever did become president, would lead this nation away from what has made us the most prosperous, greatest nation on earth. So the answer is that we will continue to look for practical policy ways that we can have better outcomes.
You'll work with us.
Of course, yeah.
Terrific. When can you meet with us?
Number one, let's be honest about that. We actually have been working and listening to many advocates already, right? I mean, that's true.
Well, we want to meet with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to do that.
Today?
We're going to have a reception afterwards, so I'd be glad to do that. I mean, here's the thing, but here's the thing. But let me make the point again. The answer, and so am I, but the answer is never going to be found in sloganeering. It's going to be found in the hard, honest work of finding solutions to these things, and we're completely open to working on that. So let's do it, all right? All right.
Thank you. I think that's very profound, what you just had to say, and thank you for your candor and for being so responsive. I'm wondering if there's a question that has something to do other than this question.
That is going to be my question. Bienvenido, señor Castro. Bienvenido a Boston. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí.
Es un placer.
Y sí, seguro que es un placer para usted, también para todos nosotros.
Y no tengo duda que tu español es mejor que mío.
Bueno, ya podrá tomar clases gratuitas, no hay ningún problema.
Necesito practicar.
Coming back to United States. My question is very short. I would like to ask you, have the government prepare for whoever is going to be the next president of the United States, how they are going to be dealing with the situation of 10 years or 15 years are going to be more baby boomers, seniors, and they are going to need some housing, they're going to need some health care, and they're going to need some help. I know for sure that Mr. Trump is kind of crazy, but I don't think that we are going to need that type of president for the United States. My question to you directly is how the government is going to be dealing with the particular about seniors. Seniors are important to serve. Thank you.
It's a very good question. You're right that, oftentimes millennials receive a lot of the attention out there, right? Every city is after the millennials. That's what has this pizzazz in the media. But the fastest growing segment of folks out there are folks over the age of 65, baby boomers who are retiring, and actually people over the age of 85. And that means that we have these particular challenges both in housing and communities in general. In housing, in fact, yesterday I was looking at a statistic that said of the housing out there, the housing stock out there, only about a third of that housing stock is modifiable to become accessible, to meet the needs of folks that may have a disability or because they're elderly, they're not able to access a regular home. And right now, only approximately 0.15% of the housing stock out there is fully accessible. So we have a need to modernize our housing stock to make it more accessible and also to produce more units for folks who are elderly who may not want to live or can't live in that 2 or 3 bedroom house anymore, can't keep up with it and so forth. So traditionally, HUD has invested in this through what was called Section 202, which invested in elderly housing, and Section 811, disability housing. The issue is that with both of these programs, even in the face of this wave of older Americans that need more housing, Congress has not appropriated funding in a few years for new units of production of that. Right. Now, let me be fair, that, and there's a certain percent, I don't want to misspeak, so I can't remember the exact percent, but a decent number of our public housing and our voucher units go to folks who are either elderly or disabled. But we see this wave that is already happening, and we're not keeping up with that demand. What that means, to answer the question, is number one, that we need to make a greater appropriation to meet this need. We need to find creative ways that we can save money. One of the most promising ways is to link health and housing. So HHS and HUD and others have been working on giving technical assistance to states to be able to make use of Medicaid dollars to provide health services that goes with senior housing so that you can save dollars on the front end instead of having to pay it on the back end for nursing home care and other longer term care that's even more expensive. How do you reduce that cost by providing those services up front? And even, I think, in the future, look at spending some of what used to be spent on that side of it into housing directly, if we can achieve those kinds of savings. HUD is studying that question right now, and my hope is that analysis will provide good evidence that will help move Congress to look more closely at this link between health and housing and cost reduction by investing in services and investing in housing directly. And I have to give a credit to AARP, which in the last couple of years especially has been very active on this issue. And my hope is that with their involvement that we can get some things done.
Really going to make me sad, but we've got a hard stop at 7 o'clock and we're already after it. So I'm going to have to thank everybody for being so patient and thank the Secretary. We've learned a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You were great. Thank you. We're going this way.